Okay friends, one of the first things you want to do to get started on this job is to safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. After that, remove all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts and then the wheel. Alright, now with the wheel off of there, we have a nice clear view of where our tie rod ends are going to be located. Now we need to start separating these tie rod ends, so looking in the center, you're going to find a 22mm jam nut. You can also use a 7/8 wrench. For this, I'm just going to go ahead and put my wrench right on there. We're going to start turning this clockwise a little bit. And then essentially, you just pretty much want to break this jam nut free. There we are. Now once it's broken free, you can continue on to removing this nut right down here that holds the outer tie rod end to the knuckle. Let's get this cotter pin out of the way first. Typically I just recycle these and then I replace them with a brand new one. Now let's remove our 18mm nut. That also had a washer on it, so we're going to make sure that we put the washer back on. And set that nut and washer aside. Next, we're going to separate the outer tie rod end from the knuckle. We'll use our hammer, and we're going to give it a couple loving bonks on the knuckle. With the outer tie rod end out of the knuckle, we can continue on by turning this counterclockwise to remove it from the inner tie rod end. Now, as we turn this, we're going to count the amount of rotations it takes to fully remove it. That was 1, 2, 3, and so on. Okay. So there it is. Now just go ahead and write down that number. Your number is going to be different for me. Mine was 21, but like I said, yours could differ. Now let's go ahead and remove that 22mm jam nut. The next thing I'm going to do is use some locking pliers on this inner tie rod end shaft. This is essentially just to prevent it from spinning while I remove my 22mm jam nut. Remove your locking pliers. Now the next thing that we're going to do is go ahead and follow that inner tie rod end to where that bellows boot's going to be located. That's right inside here. What we're looking for is a clamp that's located on the outside. Sometimes the clamp might be missing and you might have a wire tie of some sort, but overall I'm just going to go ahead and try to clean this down so we can have a look, and I should see a metal clamp in here. Now if you have the clamp, just go ahead and use some long nose pliers, grab onto those 2 ears, just give them a little squeeze, and then slide that clamp up and off of the bellows boot. Now we're going to move along to doing the inner clamp for this. Now what I want to do is just follow that bellows boot down along the back side of it or towards the rear of the vehicle, and I'm going to find a little metallic tab which is part of the clamp for this. Once I rest my pry bar on it, I'm going to give it a loving bonk with a hammer to break it free. Now with both of those clamps off of there, I'm going to reach inside here, grab onto that boot, give it a little twist to break it free from the power steering rack, and slide it right out. There we are. Now we're going to slide it down the shaft of the inner tie rod end. All right. So now that we have that bellows boot off of there, you just want to give it a quick inspection. Make sure it's soft and pliable and it doesn't look like it's torn or worn in any way. Assuming it looks good, you can go ahead and clean it up and set it aside. Now that we have the boot off of there, let's have a closer look at the inner tie rod end. All the way at the far side where the ball and socket is, if you were to look at it, you're going to find like a plastic sheathing that goes over this portion. We actually want to use a pry bar and a hammer, and we're going to give it a couple loving bonks just to drive it off of there. Now the next thing we're going to do is use an inner tie rod end tool, and there's all sorts of inner tie rod end tools. This is just the one that we happen to have. Essentially, I'm going to put it right over that ball and socket, tighten it up as much as possible, turn it counterclockwise to remove it from the power steering rack. Now let's get our tool with our extension on here. Turn this counterclockwise. There we are. That broke free. Now I can remove my tools. Let's go ahead and get this thing off of here. There it is, friends. Let's get this out of here. Now we're going to inspect the threads where that inner tie rod end needs to go. Once that's inspected, go ahead and clean up the shaft and the threaded area. All right, friends, now it's time to install our brand new inner tie rod end. Now for this, we want to pay attention to the threaded area. You might sometimes see people put red thread locker on there. You do not need to use any thread locker for your inner tie rod end. With that said, let's go ahead and put this in here. I'm going to screw it in by hand, and then I'll go ahead and make sure it's nice and tight with my tool. Alright, so now we're just going to go till this bottom's out, and then we're just going to give it a little bit extra. You just want to be very careful not to damage the rack by over-tightening this. Remove your tool. With your inner tie rod end, you're going to notice it came with a little grease packet. Go ahead and rip off one of the corners, squeeze a little bit onto your gloved finger. And then we're just going to go ahead and pack this ball and socket area here. This is going to help lubricate it, and it's going to help make sure that no moisture makes its way in and causes any issues. More the merrier. Work it around. Now we can grab our bellows boot. Now continuing with that grease, we're going to come right up to this area on the inner tie rod end. You can see that there's a little groove right there. That's the groove where the boot's going to sit. So I'm just going to put a little bit of this grease right here. This is going to help the alignment professional down the line. Okay, now it's going to be time to install our bellows boot. Now for this, I always just take a wire tie and I make a nice big loop that just goes right around it. We'll keep this nice and loose. Once you've got that loop on there, let's go ahead and slide this onto the inner tie rod end all the way down to that inner portion where it's going to connect onto the power steering rack. Now we can get ready to install our bellows boot. What you're going to notice is I went ahead and used a wire tie on this end right here. Now I can slide this onto the inner tie rod end all the way down till it connects onto that power steering rack. And then we'll tighten up our wire tie. It's important to make sure you completely get that boot situated on the power steering rack all the way around. If you don't, there's a possibility moisture or debris can make its way in and it's going to wreak havoc. Once it's on, tighten up that clamp. Make sure that's tight. Trim off the excess. Now we can either put on our clamp that we had removed or of course replace it with a wire tie. My clamp is still good, so I'm going to reuse it. Squeeze those ears, slide it on. Inspect it, make sure it's all the way on. Give it a little wiggle, make sure it's secure. Now we can apply some copper never seize to the threads. Time to install the jam nut. We'll put this on approximately halfway. Time to put on that outer tie rod end. To do this, we're just going to start it on, and then we're going to turn it back in the same amount of threads as it took to remove it. 1, 2, and so on. Now once you have it on, the same amount of threads as when you removed it, go ahead and put it up and over the knuckle here, slide it down and through. Let's take our washer and our nut, we'll put it on here and bottom it out. Once it's bottomed out, go ahead and torque that nut to 22 foot-pounds. Now, once you have the nut torqued, the next thing that you want to do is pay attention to the slots that are on the nut in comparison to the hole that goes through the stud of the outer tie rod end. If it's not lined up, continue tightening this nut until the very next slot does. Let's take a cotter pin, slide it right on through, and then pin it over. Now let's continue on by bottoming out the jam nut up against the outer tie rod end. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn that counterclockwise. That's going to pull the nut outward towards me. Now the next thing I want to do is hold this area so it doesn't spin, and then we'll use our wrench to tighten that jam nut. Make sure that's nice and snug. After you have that snugged, you just want to pay attention to the outer tie rod end in comparison to the knuckle. Essentially, we want them both to be pretty much level with each other. We don't want the outer tie rod end to look like it's tipping to one direction or the other. All right, so now you just want to double check everything. Make sure everything's tightened and torqued and situated perfectly. After that, let's go ahead and get the wheel up on here. Now we can start on all of our lug nuts. We'll bottom them out, get the wheel back on the ground, and then we're going to torque all of the lug nuts to 100 foot-pounds. All right, the wheel's back on the ground. Let's torque these to that 100 foot-pounds. Torqued. Okay, friends, we got the car back together. What's left to do now? Now, typically, you're going to want to hop in that passenger seat, take it for a little road test down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.